Forgotten Voices of the Great War, 1918, from the Toll House Inn, Lancaster. Message from Field Marshal Haig. In that trench came up Field Marshal Haig's famous message. Backs to the wall. Every man will stand and fight and fall. No more retreating. By transferring many of their divisions in Russia to the Western Front, Germany enjoyed a temporary numerical advantage over the Western Allies, with 192 divisions against 169. The German army was reorganised to maximise its chances. The youngest and fittest soldiers were concentrated in special attack divisions. The oldest and weakest were concentrated in second-line divisions, only really capable of static defence. On March 21st, 1918, the British Fifth Army was subjected to the most intensive artillery fire of the war. 6,600 guns pummeled the British positions, and an early morning fog meant that the stormtroopers leading the German attack were on top of the British before they knew what was happening. The attack broke down in several places where the fog lifted or local resistance was well coordinated, but the line was penetrated to considerable depth elsewhere. Some units were surrounded, others were compelled to fall back as their flanks were left in the air. By March 24th, the Germans had advanced 14 miles, the greatest advance on the Western Front since 1914. The British were driven back to the old battlefields of the Somme. However, if the British were finding some disagreeably familiar sights, the Germans were staggered at what they discovered. British supply dumps were packed with foodstuffs, not seen in Germany for years. They were told that the Allies were on their last legs. The Germans were appalled to find their enemies living in what was, by comparison, a lap of luxury. The perennial problem facing the attacking forces on the Western Front was how to advance over a battlefield. Even if the enemy withdrew, the great artillery pieces that destroyed all before them were mostly horse-drawn, and to get them across the churned-up fields they created required new roads, if not railways. Ludendorff planned a succession of blows at different parts of the front to avoid sustained assaults across the old Somme battlefield. The main phase of this offensive was scheduled for March 28th, an attack near Arras, intended to drive all the way to the Channel coast at Boulogne, 72 miles up the road. Preceded by an equally ferocious barrage, 9 German divisions attacked 4 British ones, but were stopped in their tracks, although a thrust at Amiens made better progress. The Germans were compelled to admit the failure of their offensive on April 5th. "90,000 British and French soldiers had been taken prisoner during the Great German Offensive. The Germans persevered, launching another smaller-scale assault near Ypres on April 9th. Again, the British were driven back, prompting Haig's famous order of the day on the 10th. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one must fight to the end. The safety of our homes and the freedom of mankind alike depend upon the conduct of each one of us at this critical moment." Further German assaults took place on the Somme on April 24th, where Villers-Bretonneux fell and was retaken by a prompt counterattack that involved the war's first and only tank versus tank engagement. 13 tanks on each side. The British won. Germans attacked the French on May 27th. The chosen battlefield was Chenandadan. In 3 days, the Germans advanced 40 miles, and by the beginning of June, German soldiers were back on the banks of the Marne, the high water mark of their 1914 campaign. The mood of crisis in the Allied camp was grave, but General Foch blocked a direct attack towards Paris, and the senior commanders on both sides began to recognise that Germany had shot its ball. German casualties from March 21st to June 1918 were not far short of 1 million. German advances had driven deep in the salient in the old front line, almost doubling the length of the front that the much reduced German army had to occupy. On July 18th, the French counterattacked, with 750 light tanks supporting their assault, and the Germans, as in 1914, found themselves driven back to the River Aisne. The British Army lost 1,000 artillery pieces in the retreats of 1918, but so massive was the British industrial superiority that they were replaced by the summer. On August 8th, the British attacked and smashed through the German front line at Amiens to a depth of 8 miles. Not that success was obtained by weight of numbers, but by superior operational ability, better artillery tactics, air superiority, and the coordinated action of infantry and tanks. Germany never recovered. The British Army stormed every successive defensive line it encountered. By the end of October, with the French now revived and the Americans more than earning their spurs, the game was up. Germany requested an armistice on November 3rd, thus averting the spectacle of an Allied offensive across the German frontier. The armistice came into effect at 11 o'clock in the morning of November the 11th, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. A cup got buried. Gunner Leonard Armsworth, 124th Heavy Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery. The thaw started on January 15th, with rain as well. It was so complete that the ground just collapsed. The end of the dugout just fell in and buried one of the cooks. He'd have suffocated if we hadn't got him out straight away. 4 of the guns were moved to Sorel that day. When we got there, the ground was an absolute quagmire. We used the gun planks, which we carried in the wagons. These planks were about 12 feet long. We ran the gun on these. We would pick them up and put them in front again. It was a bloody nightmare of a job. Corporal Ivor Watkins, 6th Battalion, Welsh Regiment. An officer, along with the company sergeant major, would come round with your ration of rum every night. The rum was given out to keep your tummy warm during the night. It was never enough to get me drunk, but 2 chaps stole a jar of rum. They were dead the following morning. They drank so much that they regurgitated and killed themselves. I remember looking at them. Their faces were white as marble. White as marble. There was always the chap who wanted to flog something or scrounge something. One chap was trying to sell a broken pocket watch to the Chinese Labour Corps. He got so fed up with them saying no chance that he threw the watch up in the air. He said there was one damn big rugby scrum to try to get it. They wouldn't buy it off him, but once he threw it up in the air, they all wanted it. Salvage price list. Captain Cyril Dennis, 212 Siege Battery, Royal Garrison Artillery. Well, of course, I was very young. I I think that the sexual aspect worried some of the older men quite a lot. I mean, it made them jumpy. I remember there was one case where a captain who was getting on in age applied for special leave. You could get a week's special leave to go to Paris or somewhere. On his leave sheet, he was asked for his reason. He put it quite boldly: sexual starvation. And to everyone's surprise and delight, he got his leave. He went off, and we all hope he's satisfied with his needs in Paris. Major Andrew Bain, 7th Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. There was a shortage of metal at home, so they wanted anything easily transportable brought back from the front. I made a list, a sort of salvage price list, and distributed this to the 4 battalions in my brigade. It said, for every rifle you'll be credited with £2, for a shell case 6p, for ammunition about 2p a dozen for spent cartridge cases, and that mounted up enormously. 1 month, the 6th Gordon Highlanders, by just combing over the ground and picking up everything that was there, collected about £6,000. 6,000. Mustard gas from the Germans. Corporal Ivor Watkins, 6th Battalion, Welsh Regiment. Near Armentières in March 1918, we were going up by night as a covering party for an Australian tunnelling company. We got into a house where there was a cellar, got some mattresses and a brazier, and made ourselves comfortable. There were some 18-pounder batteries behind us, and Jerry started shelling them with mustard gas shells. Our gas guard must have been killed. Gas is heavier than air, and it must have got into the cellar, because when we woke in the morning, we felt our eyes burning terribly. We started rubbing our eyes. We soon realised with the smell what we had done. Our eyes were watering profusely. They were burning like hell. From the clearing station, I was rushed to the 2nd Canadian Hospital. Within 4 days, I was at St Luke's Hospital in Bradford. They attached a sign on me: gas shell, very severe. Was I going to be blind for life? What was I going to do? My trade, my employment, gone. It hit me very, very hard. For the first month, I couldn't recognise anything. Then there was a gradual haze. I had a Scottish Army sister, and I'll always remember her words: Taffy, I'll get your sight back, don't worry. I was given goggles to keep the glare out. I also had burns to the tender parts of my body, which they treated with ointment. I inhaled from a steam kettle, and then I started smoking to clear my chest. But it was just soothing my nerves. We were treated right royally. We were given cigarettes in hospital. It was fashionable to smoke. I eventually recovered my sight, but so many didn't, and I had my 20th birthday in that hospital. 2 brave men. Sergeant Major Richard Tobin, Wood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. On March 26, we dropped into a trench. It was a trench we knew of old. We had started to retreat on March 21st, 1918. And here we were back in the trench we had started to attack from on November 13th, 1960. The photograph shows 2 British soldiers killed in the German advance of March 21st, and you can see someone has taken their boots. Devastation. Lieutenant Ulrich Burke, 2nd Battalion, Devonshire Regiment. We waited for them to come, and after we'd shot and killed quite a few, we retired. We seemed to be retiring constantly. We were never still. You never knew when you would eat or pick up ammunition. Some of the men got windy. Now if an officer behaved like that, the whole lot would have panicked. The only thing that kept them there was respect for your bravery and your attitude. You knew what you were doing, and you were saving them all. You could, and that kept them steady. The photograph shows devastation after an 18-pounder battery was caught by shell fire. Exchanged a wounded German for a 6th Durham lad. Gunner George Cole, 3rd Northumberland Brigade, Royal Field Artillery. We were cut off from everybody else, repairing telephone lines. We never carried rifles or anything. We took shelter in a dugout. But when we came out, the Germans were standing there. They told us to carry their wounded colleague to a casualty clearing station. Marky and me were carrying a big fella with a wounded leg. As we trudged along, we saw one of the 6 Durham lads lying wounded. So we tipped the German into a shell hole and picked up the 6th Durham lad. I said, for God's sake, don't mention this. We'll be shot out of hand. The photo shows men of the Queen's Royal West Kent Regiment awaiting the Germans. 2 stumps waving in the air. Captain Maberly Esler, Royal Army Medical Corps. When the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux near Amiens started, first of all we were gassed heavily. The only place I could find as a first aid post was a large quarry, a cave at one end, and in a much bigger cave at the other end I put the stretcher bearers and all the drugs. Unfortunately, a shell fell short, hit the top of the quarry and buried all the stretcher bearers, killing them all. Captain Toy, who was awarded a VC later on, came and asked me where the stretcher bearers were. Under that law, I said, pointing to a huge pile of rubble. He said, you've got to get out of here as quick as you can. You're going to have a hell of a walk, because the Jerrys are putting down a tremendous barrage between here and Villers-Bretonneux. So we started to walk, 180 strong, and we arrived with 21. People asked if you were frightened. Of course I was frightened. I had a sergeant beside me. Suddenly a shell went up. As the smoke cleared, I saw him sitting with his 2 stumps waving in the air. His legs completely shot off. So I said, we'll take you to the side of the road because we have nothing to carry you with. And I hope you'll be picked up. It was an awfully painful decision to make. I had about 5 people clinging to me, one with his jaw blown away, bleeding all over me. And that's how we ended our march. It was an absolute nightmare. Getting through that day was a miracle, really. I don't know how to describe the events of the day, except to say it certainly was a miracle. The officer and his horse took off. Captain Stephen Westman, German medical officer. One day we got an order to attack the brickworks in the Leith sector. The only possible means to take them was by a surprise attack in full daylight. We cut zigzag lines through our barbed wire entanglements. At noon we went over the top. We ran 100 yards all the way under machine gun fire. The losses were staggering. We got orders to lie down. Nobody dare lift their head because they would machine gun any movement. The British artillery opened up and the corpses, the heads, the arms, the legs flew about all over the place and we were cut to pieces. Private William Hall, 2nd Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment. We were manning an isolated position in the area of trenches with a mixed body of men on a hilltop and expecting Germans to come in from any direction. As they had broken through, one of our staff officers rode up on a horse and said, now men, I want you to stand firm on this hillside. You've got a good position, you should be alright. The men didn't take any notice of him whatsoever. They began to stampede and they said, we've got no chance, sir, no chance whatsoever. The Germans are coming up and they've got tanks. So the officers started appealing to us. Men of the East Lancashire Regiment, you have a good reputation. And I replied, it's not much good here, is it, sir? Just at that moment, the German tanks came up the hillside and started firing. Well, that started it. The staff officer and his horse got off his mark as quick as he could, and all the men started running down to this wood at the hillside, down into the wood, away from the tanks and safety. Firing Squad. Captain Mabley Esler, Royal Army Medical Corps. When we were having our fortnight's rest out of the line, when you were in the trenches, you had a fortnight in and a fortnight in a village 2 or 3 miles behind the line. A resting period. It was during one of these periods that the Colonel sent for me and said, I have a very unpleasant duty for you to perform. And then he told me what it was all about. Apparently, one of our men had absented himself from the front line on 2 occasions when a battle had started. And after the battle was over, he came back making some excuse that he'd mislaid the way. They court-martialed him and sentenced him to death by firing squad. And my task was to pin on his heart a piece of coloured flannel so that the marksman had something to fire at. The firing squad consisted of 8 men. Only 2 of them had their rifles loaded, the other 6 carried blank ammunition. That was so the men would not know who had fired the fatal shot. I was anxious in case they missed him or didn't kill him completely, but when they fired, he fell to the ground, writhing as all people do. Even if they are dead, they have this reflex action and writhing about, which goes on for some minutes. I didn't know whether he was dead or not, but at that moment, the sergeant in charge stepped forward, put a revolver to his head and blew his brains out. And that was the coup de grace, which I understood afterwards. I learned afterwards that this was carried out in these cases of shooting. America enters the war. Sergeant Melvin Krulwich, United States Marine Corps. We left New York in a convoy of 8 ships, plus some warships. We had submarine warnings about halfway across, and several submarine attacks during the trip. We came through all right, with no losses, and landed at Brest. On the trip across, we all slept in hammocks, and had an allowance of a small amount of water each. When we got to France, there was intensive training from French and British instructors who had already had 3 years' experience of the war. We learned trench practice, how to handle a knife, so we were trained right down to the bone. Our boys were ready for war. We were regular Marines. That was our profession. Private John Figorovsky, 1st US Division. When we landed, we paraded through the town of Saint-Nazaire. The French people were delirious with joy. We felt so proud and important that such a fuss was made over us. The mayor even proclaimed a holiday. Of course we were looking forward to a great adventure ahead of us. We were looking forward to the fight, but we didn't stay in Saint-Nazaire for long. We were marched out of town where they had some cantonments, that's a military garrison or camp. When we trained with the French troops, they were very cooperative. Most of them were short, and it seemed they lived in their clothes. They were very nonchalant about everything. I guess they were tired after 4 years of warfare, and they were surprised to see that we were so eager to get into the fight. Machine guns were deadly. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. I think if the Americans hadn't come in, it would have been stalemate. In which case, because the Germans had had enough too, there would have been negotiated peace, but the fact was that suddenly there were all these Americans, hundreds of thousands of strong, healthy, well-equipped lads whose strength hadn't been impaired in any way. They were ready to go, just as we had been in 1914. After the Bolshevik Revolution, we knew that eventually they would release hundreds of thousands of German troops, but we weren't bothered. Life was so precarious anyway. You lived from day to day. You never thought, well, in a few months' time, they'll be challenging us, because we didn't expect to live that long. We trusted our generals to a certain extent, but we really didn't know what was going on. Lieutenant Robert Pustis, French cavalry. After 1 month with Americans, we were quite close with them. Unfortunately, there was a German machine gun always firing. We always heard the noise of whizzing and whistling of the bullets. There were 4 Sammies, as we call them, in front of us. I shouted to them, lie down, and they replied, oh monsieur, ce ne fait rien, it's all right. Then I heard the rattle of a machine gun again. All of them were, I would say, I hope not killed, but I would say put down. Battle of Cantigny, May 28th. Private John Figurowski, 1st US Division. We got there 5 minutes before we went over the top. And then finally 5,000 guns started to fire over our heads. We jumped from our trenches after getting a signal from the company commander, who warned us not to go too fast because we had to follow our barrage, which was moving 100 yards in 2 minutes. We got to the first trenches. A lot of Germans were dead. We jumped over the trenches, captured the second line of trenches. Travelled through the wheat fields. The Germans began to send a counter barrage towards us. We started out 5 paces apart, but then it got to 100 yards apart because of the losses. We got to the third line trenches of the Germans. There we stopped for a few minutes. All that day was terrific fire. The next day we went forward to relieve the 1st and 2nd battalions. And that's where we met the strongest opposition. The second day, we went forward 10 paces apart, but before long, we had so many losses that you could hardly see the men on your right or left. As I started out, a German machine gun on high ground spotted me, so I pretended that I got hit, and he turned his gun in another direction. I got up after 10 seconds and continued. I wasn't fooling him. He turned his gun on me again. I fooled him twice. I needed to tell the man on my right to close in. And just as I was signalling him, that same German machine gun that tried twice before to get me finally got me. The German accept a brutal truth. Major Hartwig Pohlmann, 36th Prussian Division. In July 1980, we tried to cross the River Marne, but after 3 days we had to fall back. The resistance of the enemy was too heavy. We also met the 1st American troops, and more of them came into the front line. The enemy became overwhelming for us, but we had to do our duty. It was a matter for the politicians to find a way to a fair peace. So we did our duty as long as we could. We had very heavy losses in that year. And the units became smaller and smaller. We were forced to form 1 company out of 2, and so on. The number of our guns diminished, and so we had to fall back from one line to another. The photo shows 4 wounded Canadian troops after the Battle of Arras. Beginning of the end. Herbert Sulzbach, 9th Division, German Army. On July 15th, our offensive started towards Reims. Preparations were enormous. The bomb barrage and gun barrage started at 1 a.m. and went on for 4 hours. The first French prisoner came in and told us that they knew of our offensive. Our mood was not good after we heard this. During the night, we found that many regiments were already in camps moved from the front towards the so-called back line. We were full of doubt. We got the order that our division had to move towards Fins, 40 kilometres away. Our offensive had failed entirely. I never forgot that night. After terrific heat, thunderstorms, downpours, it was regiment after regiment moving back. We were drenched and fell asleep on our horses. A few days later came the order of the day, July 18th, telling us that enormous attacks out of the Bois de Villers-Cotterêts had started. We were told that the opposing forces were so great it couldn't have been French and British alone. After July 18th, we moved into the front line and were attacked by a barrage, which was absolutely unbelievable. It was the worst barrage and the worst gunfire I ever heard, and I had been through the Somme. The retreat came at the end of July. It was hardly possible to get through the gunfire of the Allies. Their aeroplanes were flying very low and bombing us in daylight, so it went on until we moved to a new line far further back. We realised that something had gone wrong. Our losses were enormous, and the gas attacks fearsome. The gas stuck into the high grass, so that even our horses had gas masks. We realised then it was the beginning of the end. Magnificent but dead. Colonel William Maher, US Artillery. When we arrived in the Chateau Thierry section, our battalion guns went into action in support of the Marines and the infantry who were in the Belle Woods. We were firing continuously, day and night, high explosive, gas and shrapnel. We realised the importance of saving Paris, and the Allied army itself was at stake. There was a lot of heavy work going on, hauling ammunition day and night. We kept off the roads in daytime, because we were under the constant observation of the enemy. During the day, we hid in the woods, cleaned our horses and equipment, and got ready for the next night's work. This went on for about 44 days and nights. Our division suffered very heavy casualties, about 9,800 officers and men, but we felt we helped. We turned the tide, and we did a good job. Captain Reginald Thomas, Royal Artillery. It was a magnificent sight as the French cavalry came out of the forest at Soissons on July 18th. Their uniforms were all new, bright blue. Every bit and spur chain was burnished and polished, their lances gleaming in the sun. And as the bugler blew the charge, the horses went into the gallop in a fan attack. 2 regiments of French cavalry. They went along beautifully, magnificently, through the wheat field in the afternoon sun, until they hit the German machine guns, which had just come up, the machine guns. They opened on them at close range and aimed high enough to knock the riders off the horses. Riderless horses went all over the field for 2 or 3 hours. At the end of that time, there was practically nothing left of those 2 cavalry regiments. Battle of Amiens. Private Sully, Australian Corps, August 8, started very foggy indeed, and as our tremendous barrage opened, we wondered how we were going to get on, but Forwards as we pushed and met slight opposition, some Germans surrendered quickly, others fought to the end. As we pushed on, wondering where we were, the sun broke through and we saw the countryside. It was unscarred, all sorts of cultivated land, and we began to feel, by Jove, the war's coming to an end. We're getting through, and we had a feeling of great uplift about the whole job. Fusilier Tom Bracey, 9th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. We took a lot of prisoners there. We were there for about 3 days, and then they shifted us up towards the quarry. I was wet and cold, and they were shelling us on this road out of Arras. We came up with the Scotch Division. I was carrying this bloody 48-pound tripod. I mean, it's heavy. I was there wishing a bloody shell would drop on me. The only time in the war I hoped a shell would drop on me, but it didn't, so I had to go on. The photograph is of Sergeant Perry Webb, 7th Battalion, Dorsetshire Regiment. King George V visits. Captain Montague Cleave, Royal Garrison Artillery. I had a phone call one morning from General Alexander. On August 8th, he said, "You're going to be inspected by a VIP this afternoon. Go into action on the Spur Maroel and be prepared to shoot at 2:30 p.m. I thought, could it be the Army Commander or someone from GHQ? Come 2:30 and a whole cloud of dust arrived as a motorcade drew up. Out of the first car stepped His Majesty King George V and all his staff, including General Alexander, BC. The King was terribly interested in the gun. Then he asked if he could see the gun loaded. All the VIPs had climbed up onto the mountain. I said, "I'm awfully sorry, sir, but I'm afraid nobody's allowed to stand on the platform while the gun is fired." So very reluctantly, the King agreed. The photograph is a 12-inch howitzer ready for action.
Shall we stop there, mate?
Yeah.
Not much to finish.
Yeah. Now we're doing. King's visit continued. Captain Montague Cleave, Royal Garrison Artillery. The gun was loaded by 12 men, 6 either side of the rammer. A little railway carriage carried the shell, weighing about 2,500 pounds, into the breach. So on the word go from the number 1, the 12 men pushed with all their might and rammed the shell into the bore. When all was ready, I saluted the King. "Gun ready, sir." His Majesty turned and said, "Fire the gun, please." A gigantic bang, and the King said, "May I look at the map? You know, gentlemen, I've just come from the launch of the 4th Army attack at Amiens. The Germans will have to rush there with reinforcements. Now at Ypres, to resist the attack of the 4th Army, I see from the railway system that they'll have to go through Douai Station to get there, so why not keep Douai Station under harassing fire from now on?" Later, I went into Douai and spoke to a local woman who said, "Well, Douai was a very peaceful place until early August. Then all of a sudden one afternoon there was a terrific explosion in the station. We thought we were being bombed. Well, it so happened that there was a German troop train in the station at the time, and a shell fell right on top of it. The people of Douai were delighted. That first round, the first of anything that happened at Douai, was the shot of King George V, so his idea worked extremely well, but unfortunately he never knew about it. Australian troops were enthusiastic. Major S. Evers, Australian Corps. Before August 8th, every offensive up to then, the guns always had to be brought up in into a position so that the advance would be halted. General Monash thought that if we could break through, have the guns in position so that the Germans would not be able to fortify their positions, it would be a breakthrough. It had to be carried out with utmost secrecy, otherwise the Germans would be able to fortify their positions and stop this attack. General Bruno White thought that if we could get a noise to drown the noise of the guns coming up, it was arranged for a fleet of bombing planes to go up and down the line, 2 weeks before the actual transferring of the guns and tanks into position. To complete the success of this breakthrough, there had to be the surprise and disorganisation behind the German lines. This was accomplished by a fleet of armoured motor cars which traversed no man's land and got behind the German lines. Wherever troops were concentrated, the armoured cars mowed them down. In the meantime, the tanks were going forward and taking position after position. Even though the Germans brought their artillery out of their pits, it was of no avail. While this was taking place, the horse artillery with the howitzers and the 18-pounders galloped into action. The Germans were surrendering everywhere. I saw one Australian private actually prodding the rear of a German brigadier, but it was the morning of victory. You could feel the hair pricking up your spine with excitement because we knew that it was going to be the end of the war. The Australian troops were for the first and only time enthusiastic. Aussies in a battle. Major S. Evers, Australian Corps. We crossed the Somme marshes on the afternoon of August 31st. About midnight we had our meal and the shells were falling. In complete darkness we were eating dirt as well as food. About 2 a.m. we went to battalion headquarters, where a conference was held with candlelight. We were then given our orders where we were to attack at 6 a.m. We wended our way as quickly as we could to the place where we met our guides. When we got there were no guides. Eventually, we found our way into the trenches. Another company found Germans in their trench before a sharp fight ejected them. I sent a message to the OC to say we were in position. In the meantime, the Germans must have sensed that we were in the vicinity, because they put down a barrage of machine guns which were hitting the back of our trench with terrific thuds. It was a dreadful sound, made more frightening because we knew we'd have to get up and charge in a few minutes. We'd advanced too far, so that the artillery did not know where our front line was. We would not have any artillery to protect us when we launched our attack. I felt very much like refusing to allow the men to go over that morning, because it was sheer murder. But of course, when the time came, we had to do our duty, and over the top we went. There were terrific casualties. Men were falling right and left all over the place. I was with a sergeant major, just preparing to run from one position when a machine gun bullet got me through the thigh. I fell on my back and couldn't get up. The bullets were zipping all around me. Major S. Evers, Australian Corps. Then the miracle happened. Suddenly the Germans came out with their hands up. They were calling, "Kamerad!" All firing ceased. Had they fired for another few seconds, there wouldn't have been a man alive. That morning I went in with 4 officers and 108 men. By nightfall there were only 8 men alive. But my remnant joined up with B Company, passed through the wood and succeeded in capturing Peronne. The incredible surrender of the Germans at that moment was probably due to Private Curry, who under heavy machine gun fire killed the crew and captured single-handedly a field gun which was holding up our advance. He then took out another post with a Lewis gun. He got a well-deserved VC. Another man, Private Crank, turned round a captured field gun and at a range of 200 yards, instead of the usual 500 or 600 yards, fired directly into the German lines. That must have been the only reason why the Prussian Guard, who were the flower of the German army, surrendered. They had volunteered to stay and protect that place at all costs because it was the last bastion before the Hindenburg line. Those huge men, brave soldiers that they were, actually surrendered to the Australians. That was the astonishing part, how the flower of the German army surrendered to the Australians. And that, I think, goes down as one of the greatest annals in the history of Australia, that the Prussian Guards surrendered that morning. Summer of 1918. Sergeant Major Richard Tobin, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. In the summer of 1918 came the breakthrough. We had left the trenches behind, those mud-sodden trenches that we had hated for so many years. We were out in open country. Admittedly, the Germans were standing up and fighting here and there, but they were going back and we were following them. The breakthrough had come. It was open warfare. We were in green fields once again. This was the test of the trained soldier and junior officer leadership. The battalion commander had to watch his flanks, wondering when to stop, when to dig in. We also had ration problems, but it looked like the end and the peace we had longed for. Lieutenant Stuart Hastie, Royal Tank Corps. The first wave of battle tanks passed over the wire of the Hindenburg line. Behind that was a collection of tanks, which were fitted specially for dealing with the wire. They were equipped to clear this wire off the ground to enable the cavalry to pass through. Each tank was fitted with a grapnel and a steel cable. The tank passed into the belt of wire, dropping the grapnel as it passed through. It then turned to the right and proceeded up parallel to the belt of wire. The effect of this was to roll the grapnel and roll up the wire, also pulling up the stakes and everything until it had a mound of wire as high as a cottage, at which point the tank would go no further on account of the tremendous weight of the wire. The cable was then cut and one tank left to join the other fighting tanks in the battle, leaving behind it a gap of 60 yards from which every strand of wire and every post had been torn up. Battle of Saint-Mihiel. Private De Luca, 42nd US Division. When we finally reached our trenches, it was raining a deluge, so we had to form a line by holding each other by our raincoats to get through the trenches, and we marched through. During a terrible barrage, which had started 15 minutes earlier by the Americans, everything was coming down. Trees, stones, rocks, everything came over our heads in the trenches. A dangerous spot to be in. We came forward until we reached our dugouts, where we rested for 2 or 3 hours. At dawn, we got the order to go over the top. We and the Germans came out of the trenches at the same time. We lost our senses. I saw a 6-foot German coming towards me. As soon as he came near me, I hit him in the chin with my rifle. He put his hand to his chin. That gave me a clear spot as I hit him in the chest with the bayonet. He fell down dead. I left him and kept following my friends. We chased the enemy. They were in full retreat all the way down from the embankment from the hill of Saint-Mihiel. When we reached the city of Château, Thierry, I joined my division. The place was littered with the dead. Only a few days before, the Marines had met the onslaught. The ground was full of holes, dead all over the place. Dead mules, dead horses, everything was putrefied. The place smelled terribly. It rained constantly, which never helped anybody. It didn't help the decomposition of the body. I had never had any training for this in my first action. I never expected to find anything so gruesome as this. American Balloon Company confidently moves forward. Private Maguire, US Artillery. Upon arriving at Villiers-Sautrey, I was disappointed to find that the battlefield was nothing like I had expected. There was nothing but mud, fallen trees and bodies which hadn't been picked up yet. It sent a cold chill up my back because I wasn't expecting anything like this. When we arrived at the front, we had to get our guns into emplacements through heavy mud. We were expected to start firing that night. 200-pound shells were rolled into position. We loaded the guns and prepared to fire. We were all scared. We never expected to find the very, very heavy conditions of mud, rain and cold. By 1 o'clock we had 30 shells shot off from our positions, and the sky reddened terribly because of the return fire. Shells were bursting into the ground, throwing mud up 100 feet or more. Full of mud and filth. Private Maguire, US Artillery. We were full of mud and filth. On arriving at our new positions in the Argonne Forest, we found the devastation at this position was worse than Villiers-Sautrey. Thousands of trees were splintered, crushed down into the mud, making it hard for us to travel. We got our guns into position because the amount of shelling done by the Germans had every man of us scared. We had never heard such cannonading prior to this position. At the end of October, we were trying desperately to get to Metz. The situation at the front was getting worse all the time. We couldn't sleep. Our kitchens were getting left behind, so we were hungry. It was a case of do or die now. Then we heard that the Germans were sending over by railroad to Metz enough ammunition to make the war last another couple of months. We were ordered to fire on all trains coming into Metz. We fired off a fusillade and blew up the trains. The sky lit up very, very bright red. We even thought the Germans had some kind of flamethrower because the flames seemed to be creeping closer towards us all the time. Because we didn't know that we had hit the target. Then we found out that we had destroyed all the ammunition the Germans were bringing into Metz to make the war last longer. Then we heard there was to be an armistice, so we fired off all our shells. Otherwise, we would have to take them back home. When we met some Germans later, they said, "What did you do? Those shells came so fast. Did you send them out by machine gun?" It was pathetic. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. We made this attack just in front of Le Cateau. It was a night attack, and preparations were made to avoid chaos as far as possible. Well, chaos occurs in broad daylight attacks, so we knew the risks at night. We all wore a silvery bit of metal on our backs so that anybody coming up from behind would know who we were. We went over the top and we met no resistance. They came out with their hands up. One came running out of his trench waving a white shirt. He nearly knocked me over. He was screaming his head off. It was pathetic. You would never have seen that in the old days. The photograph shows men of the Worcestershire Regiment well prepared and holding their position. Red, orange, green and white like a rainbow. Sergeant Melvin Krulovich, United States Marine Corps. Every piece of artillery in the American Army and the French Army opened up. The action produced a symphony in colour. You had the red artillery flares, orange flames coming out of the cannon, green signals indicating possibility of gas attack, and you had the shells bursting in the air, creating a white colour. The artillery fire had almost wiped out the first row of trenches. One or two of our boys were wounded. A great shout of triumph went up when we made the German prisoners carry our wounded back on stretchers. We were then attacked by long-distance machine gun fire from the heights of Bayonville, which we took later in the day. The Germans were so hungry they would shoot a horse and cut steaks out of the rump. Finally we reached our objective, which was to cut the Metz-Malmedy Railroad on the heights looking down on the Meuse River. We cut that on the last night of the war, November 10th. We crossed the river that night and made an attack on the other side. To us the fight was just like any other fight. That morning we found our wounded and gassed boys lying around on the ground and we took care of them. We expected an infantry attack, but the Germans never came that night because there was too much gas in the woods and they took a chance of being killed themselves by their own gas if they attacked. So they let go with a box barrage of the high explosive shelling and mustard and phosgen gas. The following morning when we collected our unit, all I had was 11 men out of a company of over 200. Muddled from start to finish. Major Philip Neame, 15th Field Company, Royal Engineers. Just before the end of the war, we attacked with an American division on our left, and we reached our objective and took thousands of German prisoners. The British divisions on our right again succeeded and got all their objectives. The two American divisions on our left were very slow in advancing and didn't get their objectives until long after we did. Then we were told to be ready for the next attack within 48 hours. We were ready and the people on our right were ready. The Americans weren't ready. The whole thing was delayed for 4 days because the Americans had got their rear area leading up to the captured trenches in such a congestion and muddle that they couldn't get their reserve troops up. They couldn't get their fresh ammunition up. We heard afterwards that they'd got their food supplies mixed up. In fact, ahead and blocking all the roads, this meant they couldn't move their artillery forward. It was a complete muddle. A beaten army. Herbert Sulzbach, 9th Division, German Army. In October, I had to leave to go home to Frankfurt to my parents. I went through the streets. I was not saluted. I was a commissioned officer, yet no one saluted. Dance halls were closed. The streets were dull. The mood of the people was really bad. We hadn't realised at the front how bad it was at home. People were fed up with war. They wanted the war to be ended as soon as possible. Victory or no victory. After 2 weeks I went back to the front line, to my comrades, to my guns, and I felt at home amongst the mud, the dirt and the lice. In spite of our retreats for weeks and months, we still received mail, bags of it, even some parcels, which didn't come from Germany, but from Belgium, where there was still some food and chocolate. The letters I received were not depressing, but some of my comrades received letters which were the most upsetting. Their families wrote, "We have nothing to eat. We're fed up with war. Come back as soon as possible." You can imagine how it affected the morale of these poor chaps. On November 1st, we were at Etro, not far from St Quentin, where we had started our big offensive on March 21st, 1914. Then we were so full of hope and broke through the British Fifth Army. Now it seems 1,000,000 guns of the British, French and American were bombing us. The war was entirely lost. As adjutant, I had to give the order of the day. On the 11th of November it was. From noon onwards, our guns will be silent. 4 years before, full of optimism, now a beaten army. They found skeletons of the Manchesters. Marine Hubert Trotman, Royal Marine Light Infantry. We were still fighting hard and losing men. We knew nothing of the proposed armistice. We didn't know until 9:45 on that day. As we advanced on the village of Goury, a runner came up and told us that the armistice would be signed at 11 o'clock that day, the 11th of November. That was the first we knew about it. We were lined up on a railway bank nearby, the same railway bank that the Manchesters had lined up on in 1914. They had fought at the Battle of Mons in August that year. Some of us went down to a wood in a little valley and found the skeletons of some of the Manchesters still lying there with their boots on, very still, no helmets, no rusty rifles or equipment, just their boots. The photograph shows the CO of the Irish Guards reading the news of the armistice to his men. British chivalry. Major Keith, officer, Australian Corps. At 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, I was sitting in a room in the brewer's house at the Cattle, which had been Sir John French's headquarters at the same time of the Battle of Mons. I was sitting at a table with a major in the Scots Greys, who had a large old-fashioned hunting watch which he put on the table and watched the minutes going round. When 11 o'clock came, he shut his watch up and said, "I wonder what we're all going to do next." That was very much the feeling of everyone. What was one going to do next? To some of us, it was the end of 4 years. To others, 3 years. To some less. For many of us, it was practically the only life we had known. We had started so young. Nearby, there was a German machine gun unit giving our troops a lot of trouble. They kept on firing until practically 11 o'clock. At precisely 11 o'clock, an officer stepped out of their position, stood up, lifted his helmet and bowed to the British troops. He then fell in all his men in the front of the trench and marched them off. I always thought that this was a wonderful display of confidence in British chivalry, because the temptation to fire on them must have been very great. They celebrated the armistice in their own way. Corporal Reginald Leonard Hayne, 1st Battalion, Honourable Artillery Company. It wasn't like London, where they all got drunk, of course. No, it wasn't like that. It was all very quiet. You were so dazed, you just didn't realise that you could stand up straight and not be shot. Corporal Clifford Lane, 1st Battalion, Hertfordshire Regiment. As far as the armistice was concerned, it was a kind of anticlimax. We were too far gone, too exhausted really to enjoy it. All we wanted to do was go back to our billets. There was no cheering, no singing. That day we had no alcohol at all. We simply celebrated the armistice in silence and thankfulness and it was all over. And I believe that happened quite a lot in France. It was such a sense of anticlimax. We were drained of all emotion. That's what it amounted to. Trooper Alexander Jameson, the 11th Battalion, the Royal Scots Fusiliers. As we advanced, we saw the terrible state of the Ypres salient. There were wrecked tanks from 1917 all over the place. I was used to dead horses and mules, but not in the numbers that we saw there. By the end of the first day, we were clear of Ypres, and on a ridge where we could look ahead and see trees and a landscape that had not been affected by war. We came out of the line at Bishtik and went to bed in a hayloft. Our sergeant came in shouting that the war was over. We went to a small village. The landlord opened his pub and issued free drinks, then went back to bed. We were made to do slope arms by numbers till 11 o'clock. Then we were disbanded. That was the armistice. The armistice. Sergeant Major Richard Toby, Hood Battalion, Royal Naval Division. The armistice came the day we had dreamed of. The guns stopped. The fighting stopped. 4 years of noise and explosions ended in silence. The killings had stopped. We were stunned. I had been out there since 1914. I should have been happy, but I was sad. I thought of the slaughter, the hardships, the waste, and the friends I had lost. The photograph is Winchester Cathedral on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Officers and men of the United States Army in tribute to their fallen comrades. Statistics, but not from the book. World War I, July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1980, also known as the Great War, was a global conflict between two coalitions, the Allies and the Central Powers. Fighting took place mainly in Europe and the Middle East, as well as in parts of Africa and the Asia Pacific. In Europe, fighting was characterized by trench warfare and the use of artillery, machine guns and chemical weapons, gas. World War I was one of the deadliest conflicts in history, resulting in an estimated 9 million military dead and 23 million wounded, plus up to 8 million civilian deaths. In April 1917, the United States entered the war on the Allied side, following Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare against Atlantic shipping. Later that year, the Bolsheviks seized power in the Russian October Revolution. Soviet Russia signed an armistice, followed by a separate peace in March 1918. That month, Germany launched an offensive in the west, which despite initial success left the German army exhausted and demoralized. A successful Allied counter-offensive from August 1918 caused the collapse of the German front line. By early November, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary had each signed armistices with the Allies, leaving Germany isolated, facing a revolution at home. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9th, and the war ended with the armistice of November 11, 1918. The War That Will End War by H.G. Wells. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919-1920 imposed settlements on the defeated powers, most notably the Treaty of Versailles, by which Germany lost significant territories, was disarmed, and was required to pay large war reparations to the Allies. The dissolution of the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires redrew national boundaries and resulted in the creation of new independent states, including Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The League of Nations was established to maintain world peace, but its failure to manage instability during the interwar period contributed to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. During August 1914, immediately after the outbreak of the war, English author and social commentator H.G. Wells published a number of articles in London newspapers that subsequently appeared as a book entitled The War That Will End War. He blamed the Central Powers for starting the war and arguing that only the defeat of German militarism would bring about an end. It became one of the most common catchphrases of the First World War. Magic.
Excellent.
Yeah.